Hey everybody, it's Sarah from Sewn Company, and today I'm sitting down with one of my great friends who's also a fantastic hand sewer, Brooke Welborn. Hey Brooke, how are you?
Hi, Sarah. It's good to see you.
Yeah, it's awesome to see you too. Brooke is a fantastic mantua maker, milliner, all around awesome person. Brooke is the workshop manager for Burnley and Trowbridge and is currently also helping out with all things Burnley and Trowbridge with websites and fabric. And I'm sure she's having an awesome time being in a place where she's surrounded by beautiful fabric all the time. I can only imagine how awesome that is.
It's very tempting.
Very tempting, yeah. Well, I appreciate you sitting down and kind of chatting about hand sewing. Brooke was actually one of the first people that laid the foundation for my knowledge when it came to 18th century dressmaking. We actually met when I did an internship way back in 2006 at the Margaret Hunter Millinery Shop, and she was my internship supervisor. So we've known each other for a good amount of time now, and I appreciate all of the knowledge and laughs that we've shared over the years, the tea we've drunk together. Brooke's an amazing teacher and all around phenomenal. She just knows so much about the 18th century women's dress. So I think she's working on something right now. What are you sewing on at the moment?
I am working on hemming a petticoat to go with what was going to be a redingote, but is now going to be a riding habit.
Okay.
Because I bought a different fabric that I liked better for the redingote.
Okay.
As I found more red fabric because I have a thing red.
Brooke has a thing for red, right? So what's the difference between a redingote and a riding habit?
The riding habit has a jacket, like a man's jacket and waistcoat. But the redingote itself is more of a mixture between a man's coat and a gown. The back of the gown, the one I'm copying actually, I'm basing this one on the redingote on one from LACMA. Not the one that everybody is used to looking at that has the pattern, but a different one that only has like one photo, but Angela from Burnley and Trowbridge just studied it and has the photos for me to copy. But I'm making the back like a lady's gown and other aspects of it. And it has the collar and the revers and the little capes. It's an interesting style. I'll be teaching a workshop in the fall on redingotes. I was supposed to do it this April, but that got postponed with everything going on. So now I have more time to make more redingotes and a riding habit.
Nice.
So
yeah, I love that kind of mix of like the feminine with the masculine style.
Yeah.
I think that looks really nice. And so when it comes to like, of course, your experience as a mantua maker, of course, you're a journeywoman milliner and mantua maker. How have you taken that knowledge of, say, mantua making into this project, since it's a style that you see like in the 1780s and 1790s, right? A little bit after the time period that you really focused on. So is that kind of cool to jump ahead a little bit and like be like a mantua maker, like changing with the fashion and adapting, adding a little men's wear, women's wear? Like, can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the redingote, it's been a challenge. It's really one of the most challenging things I've worked on since I studied the polonaise back at the end of my apprenticeship in 2007. It's not something I've ever done, and there are parts of it that my mind is still trying to like get wrapped around with the way the collars work. But there's other parts of it that I know very, very well about the pleating of the gown and how to construct the back. But since I work so much from lining shapes, I'm taking lining shapes that I've worked with before that I really like the way they fit, and then adjusting to get that fold back that's so typical with the front of a redingote. Because I'm not just sticking on little bits here. It's all one piece up the front and then folds down. And getting that to lay right with how it also that goes over the shoulder and fits in with the collar. It just takes a lot of trying over and over in linen or in muslin. I don't want to cut into really expensive wool until I know I've got it the way I want it to work.
And actually to kind of back up a little bit, because some folks that are listening may not realize how a mantua maker cut clothing. So a lot of folks who make historical clothing today, of course, rely on a paper pattern, or they've taken a workshop from you and they know how to cut on the body. But some folks may not know kind of what the baseline theory of what you're referring to really is.
Well, basically, I mean, it's what you and I were doing in the millinery shop back when I was finishing and you were starting, and then you definitely developed it a lot more. And it's what we do in the workshops now with Burnley and Trowbridge is, all of the shapes for the fitted parts are cut right on the body, and then those are used to then cut all the outside parts, or you can make all the outside parts to fit that lining. I used to, when I was starting to work as a Mantua maker, I used to do all the outsides first, which can be really complicated with all the fabric, and you feel like you need to put it, on a mannequin. This is just here because I was having fun with fabric the other day, trying to get the pleating right, but I don't usually put it up on something. I have the shape for what I want the back lining to be that I cut off the person and their stays, and then I could just pleat to fit that lining and pretty much make up an entire gown without anyone being there, just to the shapes. I mean, I did that last year for the young Martha Washington at Mount Vernon. I cut a lining shape for her, and then I went back to Chile, where I was living at the time, and made her the entire gown to fit the lining, and then had someone deliver it, and it fit.
That's amazing. That's so cool to know that you really only need a little bit of time with your customer, cut, fit, and then go from there. That's amazing. So when it comes to the redingote then, and you're working on the collar, so you have shapes that already fit you. So I'm assuming you're making this for yourself?
I'm making the first one for myself.
Okay.
And then I might be making the second one to fit my cousin, Ginny, as she's a different size, different height. And I'm going to try a different style on her, or I may just make two for myself. It depends. But Brittany, who works here at Burnley and Trowbridge as well, she is planning on making one. And so I'm going to work on cutting and fitting one for her out of a different fabric. And I've already cut and fit one with one of my students back in Chile, Larissa. She started one out of a blue and blue striped silk. And so that was like our first work through. We haven't gotten all the way through because then we traveled different places. So we haven't done the sleeves yet, but.
That sounds beautiful though.
So maybe you're going to need one too.
Maybe. I'll have to make a pair of stays that fit me. But I love the look of the redingotes for sure. So when it comes to the collar section, are you just building from the lining shapes and then just putting it on to kind of play with how it folds? Like, yes, is that what you're doing? Okay.
That's what I'm doing because I haven't studied in the tailoring way with the drafting, which I probably could try to do on paper and then turn it into fabric and see if it works. But for me, that's just completely opposite of how we were trained to do things, that I just want to take it from the fabric on the body and see what works. I mean, and it's going to work differently in different fabrics. I mean, a silk taffeta is going to lay differently than, a wool, depending on, a twill weave worsted is going to drape differently than a plain weave, but we'll see. And I'll see what kind of interlinings I need to keep it crisp so it doesn't be droopy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it does seem like a balance because looking at the images at least, and I haven't seen an original one before, but they appear as though there's a little bit more of a softness to the collar than there is, say, for like a man's coat. So it seems like you need a little bit of structure, but not so much structure that it's, it's not in competition with the softness of the bodice. Because does it have that nice soft kind of rounded stays that it's being made over with more of like the natural waist look? Is that kind of what you're going for?
The one I'm doing, yes. I'm making one that's definitely more 1790s. Okay. So the waist is a bit higher. The back, the blue silk one that I'm copying from LACMA has a very straight waistline as opposed to the one that everyone has the pattern for that they have, that you can download. That one has a very angular drop down point. which is more, I think, late 1780s. And it only has, 2 pieces in the back that flow through. There's not any complicated pleats. So I think it will work really well in the fabrics I've chosen. I'm glad I've switched, because this plain woven tropical weight worsted is way too thin, I think, after looking and sewing on it. It's very easy to sew on. I mean, it's very, and my distaste for wool up to this point. I've now come over to the side of wool and all of its wonderfulness, because it's just lovely to sew on.
So do you feel like, so that's interesting. So when it comes to hand sewing, I mean, I've found that a lot of my knowledge is pure just experience. Like from what you're talking about, it's like you take the baseline of the hand skills that you have, the baseline of the things you've studied, and you kind of just go from there and you continue to experiment until it looks good, it lays right. And I mean, you're an experienced Mantua maker. I mean, you've been doing this for, I mean, how long have you been sewing 18th century clothes? Style clothes?
18th century, well, I've been sewing 18th century clothing by hand since 2001, when I started my apprenticeship at Clone Williamsburg.
Okay.
During college, where I studied theater at William and Mary, I did costuming by machine, and we did a production of The Beggar's Opera. Brenda Rousseau, who's actually in charge of the costume design center at Clone Williamsburg, she was the designer for the guest designer for the play, and so she had us sew lots of 18th century clothing, but it was all modern construction with industrial sewing machines. But you can make a shift really fast that way. You can make a lot of shifts, but it's not very relaxing. And I've been wearing 18th century clothing even longer than that. I mean, I started working in 18th century clothing in 1986 when I was 7 years old. So, and my first gown was actually a wool gown, and I didn't have a shift, and it was very itchy. And that's where my aversion to itchy wool started. And I've gotten over it as I've touched lots of different wools and realized there's a whole range of what it can be like. But so yeah.
And wearing a shift underneath your clothing also helps, right?
Yeah.
Like necessary.
And
petticoats and stays and everything. So that's interesting. So you started out looking at 18th century clothing, probably being very excited about it from the customer's perspective, and then you shifted over as an apprentice, where the millinery shop, of course, is interpreting to a visiting public. So using 18th century techniques and technology, which of course is hand sewing. How do you feel like, how was that transition for you, going from first making an 18th century style dress on a machine and then kind of going backwards in time and relearning how it was made, say, in 1775?
Well, it was really interesting because with my apprenticeship, I didn't cut and make out really any gowns at the beginning. I was doing a lot of hemming and seaming and petticoats. I made so many petticoats and aprons, and to the point where, I wasn't measuring for the pleating, and I wasn't really even thinking about like what stitches I had to do, because I was just doing it over and over until it became just part of what I did. And by the time I got to actually learning how to cut out the gowns and how to sew the gowns together, I'd sort of forgotten the other way of doing it, the more modern way and the order of operations. So now that's just all I know. Whenever I see a pattern or I'm working with someone who is doing modern construction of an 18th century dress, it's a bit of a struggle to me to be like, ooh, which way do we want to do this? We did that in Chile, where I was living last year. We did Beauty and the Beast, and we did it with 18th century style, but we had to make everything on machine. And it was really hard for me to be like, but it'd be faster if we did it with the 18th century construction. But no one that I was working with understood that, and we ended up with some interesting hybrids.
So why do you think that doing 18th century clothing by hand is faster than a machine? Because I mean, hand sewing, takes a little bit longer, but I mean, I agree with you. I think it does go smoother and it makes more sense. But why do you think that? Like, why do you think the hand sewing is helps with that versus the machine?
Partly because it's not just in the making, it's in the remaking. It's a lot easier to take things apart in certain places, taking a hem out, taking seams out if it's just been, an easy running stitch with a few back stitches here and there. And it's easy to clip the thread and take it out, and it's not going to damage it like the way sometimes you have with the sewing machine with those tiny stitches.
Do you think it has to do with like the order of operations? Like, for example, like for putting in the linings, like I love how in say, a gown bodice, all you have to do is just turn it back and put the lining on it and fell it into place, or you top stitch your back all the way through the lining, and everything just seems to kind of flow together so well. And you don't really have to get up to use an iron, because we don't really use irons very much. And it seems like the hand sewing kind of flows together nicely if you're kind of using that. It almost seems like you have to kind of pick one or the other in a way, not always. I mean, but I feel like mostly you do, because I feel like the theory and the techniques kind of fight with one another a little bit.
I think a lot of it has to do with how the fabric ends up laying. I can tell if someone's made something by machine or if they made something by hand, just because the fabric sits differently. It almost sits differently on the person. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with when you're stitching by hand, it does something different to the fabric. I'm making a pair of overalls from the Decades of Style pattern, the Ophelia overalls, and I'm doing the whole thing by hand, mostly because my sewing machine wasn't working when I wanted to start doing it. And now I'm halfway through, and I might as well keep going because I'm just loving the way, not only the feel of stitching on that linen. I'm using this really pretty pumpkin and natural check that I found here the first week that I love the way it feels, and it has got this grid that I can follow. But I just also like the way all the seams look. The fabric just seems, I feel like if I'd done it on the machine, I wouldn't have liked the way those seams turned out.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense to me. So you've been able to take your 18th century knowledge and really jump into the modern world. And
yes,
and
I had to change the order of operations and the construction, just like what you were talking about. So I am putting it together more like an 18th century gown.
Yeah, but it goes together well, right?
It's going together really fast and really well. And I'm really happy with how it's turning out. Hopefully I'll be wearing it by next week. That's the goal.
Nice.
I actually have a piece of it here, or I had a piece of it here, but who knows where it wandered off to.
Oh, the fabric?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, before we jumped on, I was commenting on how much I love your jacket, because I love the color of it and it looks like a really lovely design. So did you sew that by hand as well?
I did not. This, okay. I'm actually going to make another one, and I think I'll sew it by hand, but this was a prototype for a company that I was sewing for when I was in Chile. It's actually an American company, but the owner was living in Chile at the same time as I was. And she had this little kimono that she'd gotten somewhere that she wanted me, like a modern one from a fashion store. She wanted me to copy it in her fabric. She designs these prints, and each print is an animal, and some of the sales of the scarves or table runner goes to, say, certain shark or jaguar or salmon. One of them is loggerhead nature preserve for sea turtles. And so she wanted me to take the one she had, make a prototype, and then make some for her out of her fabric for customers. So I had to do it pretty quickly, and I went, and she wanted it done by machine, so I had to do by machine. But I think it would have been easier by hand because the way the seams were done, it was just so much work. So I want to try one in linen by hand and see if I can make it faster.
Yeah.
But yeah, the company's called Beastly Threads, okay. And it's all printed in India, but it's all like organic and very natural dyes and a lot of fun. It's nice fabric to sew on.
Cool. Yeah, it seems like you keep going back to like the way the fabric feels in your hands seems to be something you really consider when it comes to what you're making, as well as perhaps one of the reasons you like hand sewing is that
Yes.
very much that connection to the materials.
Yeah, I definitely like sewing on silk a lot. But it's been really interesting when it comes to like cottons. There's a lot of printed cottons out there that have been really popular. And I've definitely found like, I know everyone loves the IKEA prints for making 18th century gowns. I think they look pretty. When I finish a little polonaise jacket that I've been working on, I will never sew on that again. It is so tightly woven and I just don't like the way it feels in my hands while I'm trying to sew it. It's very hard.
So do you have any advice, I guess, for someone who's just starting out hand sewing when it comes to textile choice and like what fabric to pick first, or since you're so focused on the fabric and how it feels and how it drapes? Because some fabrics for beginners can be a nightmare and really, put people off hand sewing because they think that it's hard because just the textile is difficult.
Yes.
But are there any like good fabrics that Brindley and Trowbridge has right now that are like really good for beginners? Or
some of the linens that we have. I mean, we have some new lightweight and medium weight striped and solid linen that just came in this week. I just got to put them up online. It was very exciting.
Nice.
But those just are great to sew with. Because you can press it, you can finger press it really well. I mean, yes, it wrinkles when you wear it, but that's fine. I mean, I know you love wearing linen.
I do.
Yeah.
I love sewing on linen, love wearing linen. Yeah.
I mean, I'm liking sewing on the worsted, but I actually find that it can be really tricky if you don't use the right thread. I did the entire hem of this petticoat with a linen and the 80/3 that we sell. And I do not like the way the stitches feel, and I didn't like the way it looked, and it was 2 inches too long. So I ripped the whole thing off. Now I'm basting it, and I'm going to re-sew it with a sewing silk to see how does that feel, because I really don't have as much experience sewing on wool in the last few years. So I really want to see, what do I like in terms of which thread, which needle, which weights are right for the different wools. But I find sewing on wool a little bit harder. I find like a linen or a cotton to be easier.
Yeah. So yeah, interesting. So it's all, again, it seems to just go back to, there's like this theme that I'm seeing kind of emerging, is that like, it doesn't matter how long you've been sewing, hand or not. It's just each project is kind of its new thing, and you just do it and you experiment, and you might make it more than once to get the way you want it to be. And the same thing with fabric. I mean, you just experiment with different types of textiles, different types of thread. I mean, obviously there is going to be a little bit of a box to work within if you are doing 18th century sewing, because obviously you're not going to make, say, like a silk petticoat using like a mercerized cotton thread, because that's just not something that they did in the 18th century.
I've done that before once when I didn't have anything else, and it was horrible.
Yeah, I was like, that just sounds like a terrible, terrible project to sew on. But there are some constraints, but within those constraints you still do have some of that personal choice to kind of figure out what feels best in your hands and what you like. I keep staring at that beautiful back that you pleated, and I just can't stop thinking about that and the textiles. And so I was just thinking about how also sometimes, like when it comes to mantua making and dressmaking, yeah, you have to go get that. The fabric also helps you in the pleating and in the way that it lays. Because like, look at that. Look at the beautiful matching of those stripes.
We have a few yards of it left. It would be beautiful on you. My skin is the wrong color for the green that's in it. So the reason I did this is because this stripe itself in the oyster and gold that we have it in, you don't notice it, but in this fabric, you can tell it's not, the repeat is different. It's got different things on different sides. And which, I mean, you do see that in the 18th century, but it's not as common, and it's not easy to work with because everyone wants things to be completely balanced.
Yeah.
And matchy. And so I was like, I'm going to figure out how to pleat this so it works. And you don't look at it and feel like it's completely imbalanced. And it took me about an hour till I was happy with where the pleats were, where the stripes were. And if you look really close, you will notice here, it's not perfectly balanced, but far enough back, hopefully at first, you don't notice.
Yeah, I mean, because my eye first sees the larger pleat with like the pink and red line, and then I see the green one, and then I kind of go out from there. Yeah, I mean, you could see it if you really start staring, but I think it looks really nice. And, you know, also, again, it's like, what's so cool about it is the lining is cut first. That's the shape that you have. So if you have a commercial pattern, you can make sure that use that like a lining and fit it to the body, and then have your fabric, such as, you know, this striped fabric here, and then you just pleat it so that you like it. Yeah. You have freedom in that.
I mean, and the fabric sort of can tell you what it wants to do. I mean, in regards to the depths of which pleats, I mean, a lot of that had to do with what I wanted to see on the outside, but I tried a lot of different ways, and there were some ways that it didn't want to work.
Yeah.
The way it was hanging, but yeah.
So I'm assuming that some of the depths are a little bit different then?
Oh, I mean, oh yeah, it's not. If I took this off, I did do like vertical lines down every pleat, and then we took it off and we laid it out and measured it. Oh no, it's not the same. But that doesn't matter. It looks right from the outside.
Right. And there's enough volume, and the volume looks correct too, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I would love to, it depends on how much we end up having left of this. We're down to one larger piece. I think we have like 5.5 yards of this left. Okay. And depending on what's ordered, we have this piece left. And if there's enough for the front and the sleeves, we may make it up in two. Because this one has a couple flaws in the fabric, which is why I used it. So
okay. Can you like quickly go through kind of, because I know what the pleats look like. Like I know what I'm looking at, but someone, say, looking at this on YouTube may not know what they're looking at. So can you kind of dissect a little bit about like what it is and how many pleats are actually there?
Yes. So I can actually unpleat it a little bit. I mean, here in the center, we've got this one goes really deep. That one goes all the way over to here.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So that's like, and we should know, like, that's not super typical of 18th century, but I mean, you know, it still could happen.
It still can happen.
Yeah.
So this one's pretty deep just because of how I wanted to get these two stripes to be together. That was basically because this is a very distracting stripe. And so I had to go quite a ways.
Yeah.
But there's this one. Normally I would only take this first pleat from about the center here. I mean, on the lining, I tend to look at like, this is where I want the shoulder straps to come in, to hit right about here. And so I'm pleating to fit within a certain width on the back lining. So we've got one pleat here, then it comes around, goes in just a little bit, comes to here. This one goes all the way across, which you sometimes do see on some of the extants. And then this one comes here, it goes in, and then there's a hidden pleat. Hopefully I don't lose all of this.
I love the hidden pleat.
I love the hidden pleat too. Oh my gosh, it makes such a difference right in this area down here.
Yeah, yeah.
And so then we've got this extra pleat that I did in here, which I did before I brought this one over. And that just really helps keep this part from starting to pull. I mean, I think there's a couple sacks in the 1780s where they actually do start to cut a waistline in the back and pleat here. Which is probably around the same time they're doing those Piedmontese where it's basically like a fitted back that they just sort of tack these pleats up to the top as opposed to making it all in one. But you just don't want it to pull too weird through here because it pulls, if this wasn't here, this would just pull the pleats out and that just
yeah, it doesn't look good.
Yeah. And I mean, I have this part of the fabric going straight, but a lot of the sacks I've been looking at, I've been realizing that this is actually angled in more into the back, that the top stitching line that goes underneath here through to the lining isn't running down the straight of grain on the outside, that it is a little bit, it's stitched out like this because this part's been pulled in to help V everything in.
Yeah, nice.
All right. That was fun.
Cool. Well, that looks beautiful.
Now, if I could only finish my own short sack that I started a year ago, then that would be good.
Is that the Polonaise short sack, or is it?
No, this one's it's a green silk. I actually started it as a long sack, but then I decided that it didn't have enough fabric in the skirt, so I cut off everything from like the hip down and just turned it into a short sack. So it's a closed-breasted, very simple. I'm going to trim it with some of the fabric that I cut off. Now I can have more trim. So it's a lot more sewing. Hopefully not a lot more hemming though, because I think I've figured out a way to cut the edges to sort of fringe them with the, but if I have to hem it, I have to hem it. I mean, it's a nice silk to sew on, so it'll be enjoyable.
That'll be fine. Yeah. Do you have a particular stitch that you like, or is it just you just like sewing on silk and it depends on the fabric?
I love doing the spaced back stitches. This like what you were doing the other day. You were showing some images online of your beautiful little spaced back stitch top stitches. I love doing that on the back pleats of an English gown and the side seams. That's my favorite stitch.
And on the sack, like the one behind you, right?
Yes, that one actually is. I probably won't do any at the top. Okay. I'll probably just do some kind of catch stitch from the inside, whether it's like
the one that creates that X.
Yeah, like the cross one. Some of them are herringbone stitch, but most of them are just that big packing stitch. But those are top stitches to just hold things in place. But yeah, any excuse that I have to do that stitch.
Well, it's so fast. I mean, it's like, it looks so good.
I did I've done the overalls I did, and then there's an apron I did by hand where I specifically made it in a way that I had to go back and like space back stitch.
Because you wanted to. I love that.
Well, there's just like a certain balance with it where like you have to have just the right weight of thread, and you have to go just far enough to give it a little bit of a bump. If you do it too small, it's why even bother? If you do it too big, it just looks like you are messy and didn't quite know what you were doing. So I like to just perfect that distance.
Yeah, I remember when you taught me how to do that, because I'm pretty sure you're the one who showed me how to do it. I remember you explaining like it's like a box. You want to make sure the distance between the fold of the pleat is the same between each stitch, so it creates this little box. And I tell people that still, like I teach people that, and every time I say it, I just like think of your like your voice in my head.
Like that's one of the stitches that I've really been enjoying looking at on extant garments. Neil, who you talked to last week or the week before, I mean, I've gone into, every time I go into collections to look at things there, I'm always looking to see how the backs have been top stitched versus the sides and the sleeves, because so many of the side seams and the sleeve seams, you know, it's really tiny. They're really close to each other, really right on the edge. But then a lot of the English gowns I've been looking at, especially the satin ones, like the ones you and I looked at last year, that had those, their top stitches were super far apart and super far from the edge. And they were really just decorative. They weren't holding the gown together.
Yeah, like some of
those could have come out, and she could have kept walking around in the dress, and it would have still stayed on her.
Everything would have been okay.
What is your favorite stitch?
Probably a hem stitch. Yeah, just because I feel like it's so versatile, and I really love the flow of getting into it when I do it. If I do a back stitch, I would say I like the spaced back stitch way better than a regular back stitch. Like I'm not really a big fan of like a back stitch that touches. Not the biggest of it. I mean, I'm fine doing it on like a sleeve, underarm, like that's fine. Yeah. But otherwise, I'm just like, like I'd prefer to do a hem stitch. I like doing like running back stitches. I think that's pretty cool.
What about on a shift? Because we're doing the shift sew alongs here, currently in Trowbridge, and I haven't started mine yet, partly because the idea of doing that many back stitches on fine linen when I have so many other projects to finish first.
Right.
But I mean, are all shifts done with like a back stitch and then the hem stitch to fill the seams, or are they sometimes, there's like a different way of doing it, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. There's a couple ways to do it. My favorite way is to do small little running stitches and then the occasional back stitch. And then like the Van Rensselaer shift at CW is done that way, for example, and then fell over the raw edges. Yeah, I like doing that because it's fast, it's strong.
Like how tiny do you do the running stitches that it will still hold?
It depends on the fabric. So it all depends on what fabric you're working with. So you probably want to stitch every, 3 threads probably?
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I can handle that.
I would say roughly, I mean, again, it depends on the fabric, but yeah, I mean, they're pretty small, especially on shifts, just because of course there's so much washing and so much abrasion next to the skin that they have to.
I still have the first shift that I made in the millinery shop in 2001.
How do you have that? Like, how is that not a rag?
I
don't understand.
There's definitely some parts of it that are worn out.
Okay.
It was really good linen. I mean, the linen we were able to get in 2001 versus what they could get, you know, when you started your apprenticeship. I mean, it was vastly different. And it was a really good linen that I used, but I also stitched like crazy. It was very tiny. I was like, if I'm going to make one shift, I'm going to make it really well. But yeah, it definitely has some holes, which is why I was allowed to take it with me because no one wanted it after I left.
They're like, that's fine. You can
please get it out of here.
Please take it from us. Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned the shift along. I guess it's not called a shift along. I just keep calling it a shift along.
I like that. Call it a shift along.
Just because it rolls off of my tongue really well. So yeah, tell me and tell the listeners a little bit about what you're referring to with Burnley and Trowbridge.
So we are doing, Christina, who you know from the millinery shop, has been helping film them, and she and Angela and Samantha have been doing several different projects. They did Pocket first. So basically we suggest what supplies you should use and then give instructions on how to cut it out. And then we release the videos on YouTube every few days or every week so that people have a chance to sew the item and then ask questions. We do a live every Friday for the, so I will get to do the next one after shifts. I was glad I didn't have to do the shift one because I'm not quite ready to sew that yet, but I get to do bed gowns. And then after bed gowns, we will be doing caps. Okay. And I'm working up a cap right now to figure out which one we want to do. You will recognize it. It's the same cap that I've been making for years. It's my basic millinery cap one.
Mm-hmm. Mark one, yes.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's just a great basic round ear cap. That's a really good beginner one. Mm-hmm. Nothing like some of those amazing ones that I know you made when you were in the millinery. All those,
just all the trim. I mean, all of those are just a basic cap with just a lot of floof on them. You know, it's just basic caps with trim, and then of course having the hair to make it sit at the right angle.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what we're doing with the sew-alongs is taking it down to the easiest thing to make, the most simple cap, the most simple apron, the most simple shift. I mean, we're not doing a shift that has all the gathers and the cuff, because when people jump into 18th century sewing projects the first time, it's not only the hand sewing that might be new to them, and that, that's something that you've been helping people a lot with is, how do you do this if you've never sewn by hand? But also just the idea of cutting out these garments without having to buy a full pattern, the order of operations, the different ideas behind, what these garments were used for and how they were worn. There's definitely been a lot of new people who are like, this is my first 18th century project that I've ever made. And that's really exciting.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you definitely would recommend these, of course, to beginners, as well as anybody who's maybe advanced and done a lot of hand sewing. It's just a fun, social, online thing to do as well.
Yes. I mean, a lot of people, when we do our lives on Friday, a lot of them just chat with each other. because they've all been working on this and they've all gotten to know each other. They're all sharing pictures on Instagram with the, show your pocket, show your apron. And so the community has really grown with doing that. Especially since, we can't do in-person workshops and classes.
Yeah.
And it's been a nice way for us to teach. And I know you've been able to do that as well, so that you don't lose connection with other people that you're sewing with.
Yeah.
I think they're also good for more advanced customers or 18th century clothing makers, because there's new things that we're always learning. There's things in the shift and the apron video that Christina did that are newer takes on things. Newer research has come out. I certainly haven't researched shifts in the last 12 years that I've been away from Williamsburg. But she has, and she studied a lot more of them. And so, we can always learn new things. Even if we think, oh, I've made that before. I don't need to learn anything about this.
Yeah. I think that's the fun, sometimes the frustrating part though. The fun of it is like, there's always something new to think about. And honestly, I've looked at that like pink lutestring gown at CW's collection that's in Costume Close Up. I've looked at that numerous times, and every time I look at it, either in person or in the book, I see something new. And I think that's another thing to think about, is like returning to the sources that you've looked at. Look at them again. Like if you looked at it last, say 6 months ago, maybe return to it and you'll see it with fresh eyes. And
exactly.
It's like you can't just read something once, you can't just look at something once, because your experience will allow you to see the hem differently, or the way that the lining's put in differently. Yeah, definitely.
With caps, I'm really excited about the cap that I'm working on, because when I left the millinery shop, we were still putting a lot of the caps together with the more modern construction. I'd done an infant cap. I copied one in the Clone collection, and I had done it the way that one was done. But then all the adult caps I was making the way that we were making them. And then in your course of your time there, that all changed. You changed a lot of that. And now I'm getting to put the caps together with, the hemming it all and then whipping it. And I'm really enjoying that way a lot more. It makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, like a night kind of, because the caps used to be constructed by hand using the same construction methods that are used at CDC, at the Costume Design Center, on a machine. So the millinery shop used to adapt the machine technology and just do it by hand. And then, continuing to do research, continuing to question what were the ideas, and then like moving into other ways of thinking about things. And I feel like everybody that's ever worked at that shop, everyone has put a mark on the shop in some way, asking questions about, wait, how is that? Janae, the mistress of the shop who we studied under, she did that too. Yeah. She had a boss who made it one way, and then she would question, wait, why are we doing it this way? Why are we constructing it in machine ways, by hand? Let's fix that. Let's change it. So yeah, everybody comes with questions, and I think we all kind of, as my master's advisor, Dr. Andy Sinet, would say, she's like, we all stand on each other's shoulders.
Yes.
We're actually all working together to try and understand these larger questions of, 18th century dress construction, and, and we all come, and we're also coming at it from different reasons, like why we do it.
Yes.
Why you might sew something by hand is different than maybe the way I would sew it by hand. They might be similar, but they might be different. And I think that's really, really interesting. So the cool thing about hand sewing and learning, I think looking at objects of the past, is, that connection to people, both then and now.
Yes.
So,
and I like to think about the Mantua makers and how quickly they had to sew those gowns, and how unfinished some parts of them are. And whenever I'm working with students and they're sewing, there's a time for sewing slowly and really getting into it and relaxing it. And then there's a time to sew and move quickly, because if you don't, you'll starve. And so whenever I find my students sewing too slow or being too perfectionist, I'm like, do you want to eat tonight? Pretend you're an 18th century gown maker.
Yeah.
And then there's the times when we can really sit down and just enjoy getting into a slow rhythm and really pretty stitching.
Absolutely. I think that's a really nice place to kind of wrap up. Brooke, this has been wonderful. It's so nice to talk to you about hand sewing and kind of reconnect a little bit and think about our past experiences. I always love hearing what you have to say about dressmaking construction, because that's just seems to be kind of your jam. So it's always so delightful to talk to you about this. So thank you for spending some time with me this afternoon. I really appreciate it.
I've gotten a lot of sewing done. I'm actually finally starting on the hem.
Nice.
After all the basting.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. I look forward to seeing it finished.
Hey, thanks for spending some time with Brooke and I, catching up and doing some sewing. If you want to hear more sewn stories, like and subscribe. And if you want to learn how to hand sew, we've got some tutorials around the channel, and we'll be adding more as often as I can. So I hope to see you again, and I hope that you pick up a needle and remember what your hands can do. Hope to sew with you soon.